On this Friday night, the chief of the Tk'emlups First Nation calls out the Catholic Church.
There has never been an apology.
Her message to Canadians and why the community doesn't want the former residential school torn down. In Manitoba, pressure to preserve the final resting place of Indigenous children.
Not even in death are they at peace.
Calls for a city to right a wrong. The race to administer the second dose.
The last thing we want now is that a variant arises that is resistant to fully vaccinated individuals.
Plus, no paid sick leave and no other options. The problem essential workers can't afford.
Global National with Donna Friesen. Reporting tonight, Farah Nasser.
Good evening, and thank you for joining us. The chief of the Tk'emlups First Nation is calling for a national day of prayer. Chief Casimir is asking all Canadians to take time this weekend to mourn the 215 children believed to be in unmarked graves at a former residential school in Tk'emlups, BC.
Now is a time that we do some important grieving and healing work in our own communities.
For many Indigenous people across the country, it has re-triggered trauma they live with every day, something the Prime Minister acknowledges.
The hurts and the wrongs, the intergenerational trauma, the layers of barriers and harms that continue to this day, not as part of our past, but as part of our present, require an awful lot of work by all of us.
In our top story tonight, Paul Johnson looks at the work that is already underway and so much that still needs to be done.
Please know that Indigenous peoples across Canada is being heard, are now dealing with trauma and deep wounds.
Acknowledging that they're coming from a place of trauma and grief, Tk'emlups Chief Rosanne Casimir gave the first update to the media since news broke of the horrifying apparent find last week. Among the things she wanted to clarify, they are not calling this a mass grave.
This is not a mass grave, but rather unmarked burial sites that are, to our knowledge, also undocumented.
As far as technical details about what equipment was used, who conducted the search with ground-penetrating radar, and how that data was processed and analyzed, those facts will be released to the public, but not now.
These are preliminary findings, and that we expect to have a final report near the end of this month.
Casimir also called on the branch of the Catholic Church that ran the school, the Order of the Oblates of Mary Immaculate, to release records pertaining to the school. She also called for a public apology from the church.
In the end, what we do want an apology, a public apology, not just for us, but for the world who also shared in those suffrages.
With the announcement that the RCMP has opened a case file on the discovery, Casimir said the Mounties will need to follow their lead on the investigation, pointing out historically the RCMP were involved in forcing Indigenous children into residential schools. As the memorial grows in front of the former school building, Casimir said their intention is not to tear it down, as other First Nations have done, but to leave it standing as a stark memorial to Canada's history of residential schools. Paul Johnson, Global News, Vancouver.
On Monday, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau said dealing with Canada's awful legacy of residential schools was his top priority, and he promised what he called concrete action. Now, at the end of the week, Trudeau is again promising concrete action, though as David Akin explains, the government's next steps are not yet clear.
Yes, there is much more action to come. There is much more work to be done.
But specifics for now are missing, though some Indigenous groups say one step would be to hand over documents that Indigenous communities say are vital to helping locate burial sites and information about children who never return home. Some of those documents are held by Ottawa, some by institutions like the Catholic Church, which in some cases has refused requests for documents.
As a Catholic, I am deeply disappointed by the position that the Catholic Church has taken now and over the past many years.
Trudeau hinted that should requested documents not be forthcoming, the government may compel their production.
We have tools that we can use because truth is at the heart of understanding our past and preventing further damage to the future.
And in Kamloops, or anywhere else in the country, RCMP and other investigators will be expected to go slow.
Let's remember, again, that this is potentially a crime scene, but also may well be considered sacred grounds, and people will have views on these that we will need to respect.
Meanwhile, there are calls for external bodies like the United Nations to investigate Canada for crimes against humanity in connection to residential schools. That's fine, Trudeau said, but only if the wishes of Indigenous communities have top priority.
It's not up to international bodies to choose to come in, although they would be welcome. It is about Indigenous communities having the tools that they need to move forward.
And so next steps from Ottawa will have to wait as the Prime Minister and his officials insist that it will be Indigenous leaders, not Ottawa, that decides what next to do and when to do it. Farah?
David Akin in Ottawa, thank you. In Brandon, Manitoba, there are calls for the city to buy back land where the remains of residential school children are believed to be buried. It was sold years ago and turned into a campground. Survivors and family members call it the ultimate indignity. Global's Marney Blunt reports.
A quiet and chilling scene. Stuffed animals, children's shoes, and tobacco lay on what was once the foundation of the Brandon Residential School, reflecting on a tragic legacy and remembering the young lives lost.
David Moore was 7 years old. When he died, he survived 3 months at Brandon Residential School. My great aunt Lydia, his older sister, was 13. She survived 1 year at the school.
They are among the approximately 54 children buried beneath the nearby Turtle Crossing campground. For years, family members, along with the Sioux Valley Dakota First Nation, have been calling for the city of Brandon to buy back and protect the land.
The ultimate indignity is not even in death are they at peace, not even in death are they at rest, because they have vacationing campers on top of where they're buried.
Kayla Matheson's grandmother is a survivor of the Brandon Residential School who volunteered to go to be with her older sister.
How do you process mass graves of small children? And how do you grieve for something that's so large? And I can't say that it was only because my grandma was Indigenous that my heart broke.
The city says the land was originally sold with a stipulation that the burial site be preserved, but as the land changed ownership, that has been lost. The mayor says buying back the land isn't off the table.
This needs to be First Nations led. We've had great collaboration with Sioux Valley, and I'm very confident that quite soon we'll have the solution for a most dignified and appropriate reconciliation for these children.
The chief of the Sioux Valley Dakota First Nation says through research, archives, and survivor accounts, they believe there are a total of 104 possible graves at 3 different cemeteries in the area. However, only 78 of those are actually on record. Marney Blunt, Global News.
Turning to the pandemic now and Canada's vaccine rollout. Federal health officials now say 65% of eligible Canadians have received at least 1 dose. In the territories, enough doses of Moderna have been delivered to fully vaccinate 85% of people 18 and up. And over the next week, they're expecting to get enough Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine for all youth 12 and up. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau says Pfizer has committed to delivering more than 2 million doses to Canada each week until the end of August. And because of the vaccine's popularity, he says Pfizer will be adding 3 million more doses in September. Now, there's still no concrete schedule from Moderna beyond June 13th, and the company has sent just 1/3 of its planned spring shipments to date. Canada's top public health officer is stressing the importance of getting 2 shots. Dr. Theresa Tam says the Delta variant, first found in India, has now been detected essentially across Canada. And as Abigail Bimman reports, more testing needs to be done and faster.
Looking for variants can take a long time, but this robot can complete genomic sequencing in just 24 hours, and its lab found Toronto's first case of the Delta variant.
So our capacity is easily hundreds, if not thousands a day.
These senior investigators estimate they're sequencing about 20% of positive COVID cases in Ontario, and they could be doing more.
There's not enough variant testing across Canada. There's not even enough in Ontario, to be honest.
Important as the number of Delta cases grows and as we learn more about it.
There's now increasing evidence to show that it is more transmissible.
Data from the UK shows fully vaccinated people are much more protected than those with just one dose, and that's the majority of Canadians.
The last thing we want now is that a variant arises that is resistant to fully vaccinated individuals. Obviously, the sooner we can get second doses done, the better it's going to be.
Provinces are shortening the gap between shots as supply ramps up. Quebec down to 8 weeks.
Close to over 3 million Quebecers will probably change their dates.
But community pharmacies in that province say there's been too much delivery uncertainty. They're not sure they'll get enough to meet that shortened time frame. While in Ontario, pharmacy phones will be ringing as that province announced the early booking age drops to 70 on Monday.
But we are examining the potential for expanding that to all age groups.
The health minister says staying ahead of the variant will be key for a return to normal life in the country's most locked-down province. Abigail Bimman, Global News, Ottawa.
In New Brunswick, the Crown has dropped a charge against a doctor who failed to self-isolate after a trip to Quebec and then later tested positive for the virus. Dr. Jean-Robert Ingola was accused of violating COVID-19 measures and charged last August under the province's Emergency Measures Act. He briefly traveled to Quebec to pick up his daughter and returned home, but kept seeing patients. The province suspended Ingola without pay after his name was leaked online as patient zero. The ordeal led to racist threats for the physician, who is of Congolese descent. Premier Blaine Higgs has been given 1 week to issue an apology or face legal recourse. Facebook updates its relationship status with a former U.S. president. Coming up, how long Donald Trump is banned from the site and why. Plus, a detained journalist's televised confession contested. There will be no return to Facebook or Instagram for former U.S. President Donald Trump, at least not anytime soon. The social media giant is upholding its suspension of Trump's accounts, extending it for the next 2 years. The announcement comes as Facebook lays out new rules for all politicians aimed at restricting hate speech and misinformation. As Jackson Prosco reports, critics say neither move goes far enough.
The January 6th insurrection was the final straw for Facebook. It banned President Donald Trump from the platform for inciting violence, a suspension the company will extend until at least 2023. They shouldn't be allowed to get away with this censoring and silencing, Trump said in a statement. The social media giant has long operated with two sets of rules. Everyday people are barred from posting hate speech and threats of violence, while politicians could post almost anything. Facebook felt that was in the public interest.
I believe that the former president should be responsible for his words, and that the people who broke the law should be responsible for their actions.
Rising political violence has led to growing scrutiny and the threat of government regulations. And so Facebook has put politicians everywhere on notice, warning, as with Trump, we will remove content if the risk of harm outweighs the public interest.
This is a global problem. We've seen, particularly in countries like India, where politicians inciting violence have been allowed to keep their posts up.
The move doesn't go far enough for tech reform advocates, while conservative groups claim a violation of free speech.
It's about corporations making key decisions about the freedom of expression and preventing harm from spreading online.
For the world's largest social media platform, not acting was no longer an option, even if that means incurring the wrath of its most powerful users. Jackson Prosco, Global News, Washington.
The family of detained Belarusian journalist Roman Protasevich says he was coerced into making a confession on state television last night. He was arrested last month when his flight to Lithuania was forced to divert and land in Belarus. He's accused of organizing anti-government protests and disrupting public order.
Очень многие начнут меня публично осуждать.
In the highly produced TV segment, the 26-year-old broke down and praised President Alexander Lukashenko, admitting he was trying to topple him. Human rights groups and the country's opposition say it's clear the journalist was tortured. His father says they broke him, and his son would never say such things. Will Canada's hot housing market cool down? Still ahead, what younger buyers are hoping for post-pandemic.
You're watching Global National.
In our series, Priced Out, we have focused on housing affordability for young Canadians. Those under the age of 35 who say they can't buy into the red-hot real estate market. Home prices have surged to new highs across the country amid the pandemic. But what happens after it's all over? Is there hope for millennials to get their dream home then? Our senior business correspondent, Anne Gaviola, explains.
Housing is very tied up with my sense of security. And my mother was a renter her entire life, and I've seen sort of the insecurity that comes from that.
31-year-old Anita Min has been hoping to buy a home with her partner for years, but with their budget of up to $800,000, she's not seeing much they can afford. The average home price in the Greater Vancouver area is more than $1.1 million.
I think the question of housing affordability plays a lot into whether or not to have kids, because housing is an expense. Children are an expense, childcare is an expense. All of these things are related.
Historically low mortgage rates, a race for space, and a rush to get into the market ahead of tougher borrowing rules fueled a surge in home prices during the pandemic. And it's not limited to major urban centres. Prices are up about 30% across Canada, bringing bidding wars and buying frenzies to cottage country and smaller cities like Hamilton, Halifax, and Moncton.
When we think about prices going forward, the fact that there's still low supply out there would argue for elevated prices as well.
Economists say housing supply wasn't keeping up with demand or keeping pace with our growing population and an influx of newcomers in the 3 years prior to the pandemic. And when borders reopen, that's bound to increase demand and prices even more. This week, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau pledged more money to address Canada's affordability crisis. He said owning a home is too far out of reach for people in Canada's biggest cities, especially young people and families. Policy experts suggest an urgent need to figure out and align immigration policies with affordability measures.
We need to make sure that the way it gets solved is both economically and environmentally sustainable.
Anne Gaviola, Global News, Toronto.
Who's protecting essential workers? Next, how Canada has failed some of the most critical people in the pandemic. Time and time again throughout this pandemic, we've been told stay home to stay safe. But for Canadians who don't have access to adequate sick pay, the decision to stay home without pay may not be a viable option. Krista Hesse on the calls for more to be done to keep workplaces safe.
This simple memorial is a stark reminder of the toll that COVID-19 has taken on essential workers.
Since then, I've been asking that question. What happened?
Amanda Young-Colucci's brother, Godfrey Young, was a longtime employee at Canada Post. In mid-January, he worked a night shift at the Gateway facility in Mississauga, Ontario. The 62-year-old developed a cough, then tested positive for COVID-19. 6 days later, he died. The facility was experiencing a COVID outbreak, and there were close to 280 positive cases. Canada Post declined Global News' request for an interview and said in a statement that it has implemented rigorous safety measures to keep employees safe and has closely followed the advice of public health officials, including distancing and screening of employees. It says it also offers paid sick leave.
Essential worker like him have to take that type of risk every day. The question is, who's there to protect them?
Workplaces like food processing, warehousing, and manufacturing continue to be a key driver of transmission. In Ontario alone, 68 workers have died after contracting COVID at work, according to the province's Workplace Safety and Insurance Board. More than 25,500 workers have been infected at work, and advocates believe the numbers are underreported. Dr. Andrew Bazari leads a team of researchers who have been studying so-called hotspots in Toronto and Peel.
What has been driving the heat and the unequal exposure of COVID?
They found that 63% of people who live in hotspots are racialized and are more likely to be essential workers in manufacturing, utilities, trades, and transport. They're also more likely to be low-income earners, often working precarious jobs without access to adequate paid sick leave.
If people were going to stand up and say, these people are heroes, which I fully endorse, we have to make sure that we're doing the work and we're providing the policies and supports that is more than rhetoric.
Every single case, every single death, these are not just numbers.
Krista Hesse, Global News, Toronto.
And tomorrow night at 7 on The New Reality, Krista looks at what some employers are doing to keep workers safe. That's right here on Global. And that is Global National for this Friday. I'm Farah Nasser. Thanks for spending part of your evening with us. We want to leave you tonight with this touching drawing by Mi'kmaq artist Whitney Gould, a tribute to those 215 Indigenous children in Kamloops. She says she was inspired by a quote, "And the small voice whispers, they found us." Thank you for watching. Good night.